Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Unstoppable Mindset. I'm your host, Mike Hingson, and our guest today is a very fascinating individual. I was just teasing her a little bit about her email address, which is operaspymaster@gmail.com. I'm telling you, don't cross her. That's all I got to say. Anyway, we'll get into all of that, but I really am glad that she is with us. Kay Sparling is a fascinating woman who's had an interesting career. She's written, she's done a number of things. She's used to be in opera. Gosh, all sorts of stuff. So anyway, we'll get to all of it and we'll talk about it. I don't want to give it all away. Where would the fun in that be? Kay, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we're glad you're here. You're from up in Wisconsin. We were going to do this a couple of weeks ago, but you had all the storms and it stole your internet and your power away, didn't it?
It sure did. Yeah, that was a terrible storm we had.
Yeah, that's kind of no fun. I remember years ago, I was talking to somebody on the phone. We were doing a sales call, and he said, I might not be able to stay on the phone because we're having a really serious storm. And he said, it is possible that the lightning could hit the phone lines. And if it does, it could come in the house. And we talked for a few minutes. And then he said, I'm going to have to hang up because I just felt a small shock because the lightning obviously hit the phone line. So we'll have to talk later. And, and he was gone. And we did talk later, though. He was okay. But still, wow. Yeah, there's a lot of crazy weather going on, isn't there? And we were just talking about the Canadian wildfires. They're no fun.
No, just everywhere is having crazy weather.
Well, tell us a little bit about you growing up and all that sort of stuff, and telling me about the early Kay.
Well, growing up, I grew up in a farm community in the central Midwest, just right in the middle of the breadbasket, you might say.
Not near where you are now.
No. Further south in very much agriculture time. I mean, skipping ahead, I remember talking to a famous opera conductor when I was an apprentice, and I made some reference, and he goes, well, how would you know that? And I said, because I grew up on a farm. And he went, oh, get out of here. Nobody makes it, to a major European opera house from a farm. And I went, well, I did. And later, I asked my mom to send me a picture because we had an aerial view taken of our homestead. And it was obvious for miles all the way around the house and the barn and all. It was just cornfields and soybeans,
What
and
state
when I showed it
were you
to
in?
him, Illinois, Central Illinois.
Okay.
And
so you showed it to him?
Yeah, I showed it to him, and he was like, well, doggone, you're not lying. I'm like, no, I wasn't kidding you. I really did.
It shows how good I really am. See how far I progressed.
Well, I was one of these kids. At 5 years old, my parents took me to see Sound of Music at the theater. And during the intermission, now I'm 5 years old. It's pretty late for me, right? But when we're in the concession stand, I tug at my mom's skirt and I say, Mom, that's what I want to do. And she looks at me kind of funny and she's kind of confused. Well, what do you want to do? Work in a theater, a movie theater? No. I want to do what those kids are doing on the movie screen. And she was like, well, honey, that's really hard to get somewhere like that. So that was when I was 5. And then when I was 7, she just, all the school and the church were telling her, this kid's got a great voice. And they kept giving me solos and stuff. And so when I was 7, she put me in the Sangamon County Fair Little Miss competition. And of course, my talent was singing. So I just sang away. I really can't remember what I sang. But afterwards, a fellow came up to my parents and introduced himself. And he said that he was there. He had family not, in the area, and that he had grown up there. But since then, he was in St. Louis, and he said, I'm a scout, and I'm an entertainment scout, and I'm actually looking for, the Von Trapp children. We're going to do a big production, and we'd love to audition your daughter. Well, we were about, I think it was an hour and a half away from St. Louis. So my parents were like, wow, that'd be quite a commitment. But long story short, I did it. And that started my professional career. I was the youngest Von Trapp,
You were Gretel.
Yeah. And so it just went from there. And, it was all Broadway, of course. And I did a lot of church singing. It got to be, by the time I was in high school, people were hiring me for weddings, funerals, all that kind of thing. And so I was a Broadway and sacred singer, went to college. My parents said, you can't depend on a vocal performance degree. What if things don't work out? You have to have something to fall back. So I went into vocal music ed at a very, very good school for that, and also music therapy. And, continued being in their shows. And when I graduated, continued the Broadway. And one night, I was also singing a little bit of jazz in Kansas City, where I was living. Someone approached me. She was a voice teacher at the conservatory there. And that conservatory had an apprenticeship with the Kansas City Lyric Opera. And she said, I knew you as an undergrad. My husband works where you went to school. And I have been watching you for a long time. And I wish you'd quit this nonsense of singing Broadway and jazz and rock and everything, and get serious with, and try opera. So I thought she was crazy to bring that up, but it wasn't the first time it had been brought up. So I have been teaching for a year, and at the end of that school year, I announced to everyone I was going to graduate school and I was going to study opera. And so
What were you teaching?
I was teaching high school choir.
Okay.
At a very big high school, very, very good choir department.
Yeah. Now, by the way, after doing Gretel, did you ever have any other parts as you grew older in Sound of Music?
Okay, that's a very cool question. I am one of the few people that I know that can say I have sang every major role in Sound of Music sometime in my life.
Ah, okay.
Because it was so popular when I was growing up. And as I would grow older, well, now you're going to sing, you just kept graduating up. And then pretty soon I sang quite a few Marias. And then after I was an opera singer, during COVID, I was asked to sing Mother Superior.
Mother Superior, yeah.
I literally have sung, in a decades-long career, I've sung every role in Sound of Music.
Cool. Well, that's great.
Yeah. So
anyway, so you said that you were going to go study opera.
And I did at graduate school. And then I got the chance to get an international grant over to Europe. And so I decided to not finish my master's at that time and go over there and finish it. And most of all, importantly, do my first apprenticeship in Europe. And so I thought that was a great opportunity. They were willing to pay for everything. And I said, I would be a fool to turn this down.
Yeah.
So off I went. And that's kind of the rest of the story. Got a lot of great training. Left Europe for a while, moved to New York City, trained with the best coaches and teachers in the world at the Metropolitan Opera, and then, launched my career.
So you've done a number of things. Of course, going to Europe and being in Vienna and places like that, certainly you were in the right place.
Yes, definitely. Um, at that time in the middle 80s, um, United States we had some great opera houses, don't get me wrong, but we had very few. And it just wasn't the culture that it
No,
was
in Europe.
in Europe. And so, yes, there was a lot more opportunity there because there was such a culture established there already.
So you went off and you did Europe and sang opera. What were you, a soprano or what were you? That sounds like it'd be a
Well,
little high for your voice.
well, you have to remember, I'm a senior citizen now. So this is the
Good
way it
point.
worked for me. Um, because we're talking decades from the age 27, and I quit singing at 63. So that's a very long time to sing opera. So I started out as, there is a voice category, and each one of those, we use a German word for that. It's called Fach, Fach. And, that is determined by the kind of vocal cords you have and the kind of training and the literature you're singing. And hopefully that all meshes together if you have good coaches and a good agent and such. And I literally have sang so many different Fachs, lyric mezzo, then to very shortly lyric soprano, and then for a long time spinto soprano, which would be the Puccini and a lot of the really popular things. And then I felt I was quite lucky that my voice did have the strength and did mature into a Verdi soprano, which is a dramatic soprano. And
Right.
not many of those around. And so that was an endeavor, but at the same time, that was a leg up. And so most of the time in my career, I sang the bigger Puccini, like let's say Tosca, and I sang a lot of Verdi. Wow. So I was an Italian opera singer. I mostly sang in Italian. Not to say that I didn't sing in German or French, but I did very little in comparison to the Italian.
Well, there's a lot of good Italian opera out there, although mostly I don't understand it, but I don't speak Italian.
Well, the great thing about most houses now is, you can just look at the back of the seat in front of you and there's the translation,
Yeah,
and
that doesn't work for me being blind.
That
though,
doesn't work for you. No, yeah,
that's okay though. But I like the music.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that. Nice.
So, how long ago did you quit singing?
Just about, just a little under 3 years ago.
Oh, okay. And why did you quit? Just was the right time or circumstances or what?
I had a circumstance. I had to have throat surgery. Now, it wasn't on my vocal cords, but it was on my thyroid. And unfortunately, the vocal cord nerve, they had to take out some cyst on my right thyroid, and they had to remove it too. And unfortunately, my vocal cords were damaged at that time. I would have probably be singing still now some, because dramatic sopranos just can go on and on and on. One of my mentors was Birgit Nilsson, famous singer from Sweden. And she was in my grandmother's generation. But I went to work with her, and she demonstrated at 77 she could still pop out a high C. And I believe I would have been able to do that too, but circumstances changed. But that's okay. Yeah. I had sung a long time, and at least I can speak, so I'm just very happy about that.
So when you did quit singing, what did you decide to go do, or how did you progress from there?
Well, I had already made a transition where I had come in 2003 to the Midwest. I came back from New York City, where I lived many, many years. And I started a conservatory of music and acting. And then that kind of grew into a whole conservatory of music. So I was also a part-time professor here in Wisconsin, and I taught voice, one-on-one vocal lessons. So high school and college and graduate school. And so I had this huge studio. So when that happened, I wasn't getting to sing a whole lot because I was much more focused on my students singing than me at that point, especially the older ones, professional ones. And so, I just kept teaching. And then I had started this book that I'm promoting now. And so that gave me more time to get that book finished and published.
And what's the name of the book?
The book is called Mission Thaw.
Ah, okay. And what is it about?
Mission Thaw is feminist spy thriller set at the very end of the Cold War in the late 80s. And the main protagonist is Caitlin Stewart, who has went over there to be an opera singer, and soon after she arrives, is intensely recruited by the CIA. They have a mission. They really, really need a prima donna Mozart soprano, which is what Caitlin was. And she had won a lot of competitions and won a grant to go over there. And so they had been vetting her in graduate school in the United States. And as soon as she came to Europe, they recruited her within a couple weeks of her being there. And she, of course, is totally blindsided by that when they approach her. She recognized that things were not exactly the way they should be, that people were following her, and she was trying to figure out who are these people and why are they following me everywhere. Well, it ends up being young CIA agents. And so when the head chief and his, the second chief approach her, she's not real happy because she's already felt violated, like her privacy's been violated. And so she wasn't really too wonderful about listening to them and their needs. And so they just sort of apprehend her and throw her in a car, in a tinted windowed Mercedes, and off they go to a park to talk to her, right? And so it's all like a crazy movie to Caitlin. It's like, what is going on here? And she can tell they're all Americans, and they have dark suits on, even though it's very, very hot, and dark glasses, so everything is just like a movie. And so when they approach her and tell her about what they need her to do, and this would be in addition to the apprentice she is doing, that, she just gets up and says, I'm sorry, I didn't come over here to be in cloak and dagger, ring. I'm getting out of here. And as she's walking away, the chief says, well, what if you could help bring down the Berlin Wall? Well, now that stops her in her tracks, and she turns around and she goes, what, are you kidding? I'm just an opera apprentice from the Midwest, grew up on a farm. What am I going to do? Hit a high C and knock it down? I mean, what are you talking about?
Hey, Joshua brought down the walls of Jericho after all.
Well, yeah. Later, someone tells her that, actually. But anyway, they say, well, sit down and we'll explain what we need you to do. And so the initial job that Caitlin accepts in the CIA to be trained to do is what they call a high-profile information gathering. She has a wonderful personality. She's really pretty. She's very fashionable. So she can run with the jet set, and usually the jet set in Europe the opera jet set is also where all the heads of states hang out too. And at that time, the prime minister was pretty much banking the Vienna State Opera where she was apprenticing. So he ends up being, along with many other Western Austrian businessmen, in a cartel of human trafficking. And who they are trafficking are all the different citizens of the countries that USSR let go. When, just got to be too much. Remember how, oh yeah, we're going to let you go. Okay. And then they would just pull out, and there was no infrastructure. There was nothing. And these poor people didn't have jobs. They didn't have electricity. The Russian mafia was running in there trying to take over. It was chaos. And so these poor people were just packing up what they could to carry, and literally sometimes walking or maybe taking a train into the first Western European country they could get to. And for a lot of them, just because the geographical area, that was Austria. And so basically the Austrians did not want these people. And they were being very unwelcoming and arresting a lot of them. And there was a lot of bad behavior towards these refugees. And so the Catholic Church, the Catholic Social Services, the Mennonite Relief Fund, the UN, and the Red Cross started building just tent after tent after tent on the edge of town for these people to stay at. And so the businessmen decide, well, we can traffic these people that have nothing over to the East Germans, who will promise them everything, but will give them nothing but, death camps, basically, just like in World War II. Mm-hmm. So you have work camps, you have factories. They don't feed these people correctly. They don't give them anything that they promise to them in the camps. And they say, okay, be on this train at this time, this night. And then they stop somewhere in between Vienna and East Germany in a very small train station in the middle of the Alps. And they have these large, basic slave auctions. And unfortunately, the children and the older people get sent back to the camp because they don't need them or want them. So all the children get displaced from their families, as well as the senior citizens or anyone with a disability. And then, the men and the women that can work are broken up as well. And they're sent to these, they're bought by these owners of these factories and farms. And the beautiful women, of course, are sold to either an individual that's there in East German that just wants to have a sex slave, pretty much, or even worse, they could be sold to an underground East Berlin men's club. And so terrible, terrible things happen to the women in particular. And the more that Caitlin learns as she's being trained about what's happening, and she interviews a lot of these women, and she sees the results of what's happened, it really strengthens her and gives her courage. And that's a good thing, because as time goes through the mission, she ends up having to be much, much more than just a high profile social, information gatherer. She ends up being a combat agent. And so, but that's in the mission, as you read, that happens gradually. And so what I think is really a good relationship in this story is that the one that trains her, because this is actually both CIA and MI6 are working on this mission Thaw. And the director of the whole mission is a very seasoned MI6 agent who everyone considers the best spy in the free world. And Ian Fleming himself, this is a true fact, would go to this man and consult with him when he was writing a new book to make
Mm-hmm.
sure, that what he was saying is, could this really happen? And that person, Clive Matthews, becomes Crane's Caitlin, particularly when she has to start changing and, defending herself and possibly,
So he
you know,
becomes her teacher.
in every way. Yes. Yeah.
So how much, lots of questions. First of all, how much of this story is actually true?
All this story is true.
The whole mission is true.
Yes, sir.
And so how did you learn about this? What caused you to start to decide to write this story?
So some of these experiences are my own experiences. And so after I, as an opera singer, decided to be a volunteer to help out these refugees, I witnessed a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so many years later, I was being treated for PTSD because of what I'd witnessed there. And then
Right.
a little bit later in Bosnia in the early 90s. And I was taking music therapy and art therapy, and my psychiatrist thought that it'd be a good idea if also I journaled, the things that I saw. And so I started writing things, and then I turned it in. And they had a person that was an intern that was working with him. And both of them encouraged me. And they said, wow, if if there's more to say about this, you should write a book, because this is really, really, really good stuff. And so at one point I thought, well, why not? I will try. So this book is exactly what happened. Caitlin, is a real person, and everyone in the book is real. Of course, I changed the names to protect people and
Mm-hmm.
their descriptions, but I, I just interviewed a lot of spies that were involved. So yes, this is a true story.
Did you do most of this then after your singing career, or were you writing while you were singing,
I was
or?
writing while I was still singing. Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
started the book in 2015,
Okay.
and because as I was taking the PTSD treatment, and had to put it on the shelf several times. Life got in the way. I got my teaching career just really took off, and then I was still singing quite a bit, and then on top of it, everything kind of ceased in 2018 when my mother moved in with me, and she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but
Mm.
Lewy body Alzheimer's,
Mm-hmm.
which is a very, very rough time. And
Yeah.
so I became one of her caretakers. So I quit singing, put that on hold, and I had to really, really bring down the number in my studio I was teaching and spend time here at home. And so I would take care of her, but then after she would go to bed, and she'd go to bed much earlier than I wanted to, that's when I would write. And that's when I got the lion's share of this book written, was during that time. It was a great escape from what I was dealing with. Believe it or not, even though there's some real graphic things in the book and all, it wasn't. It was a nice distraction.
Wow. So you lived this, needless to say.
Yes, I did.
And
Yes.
so you've talked a little bit about what happened to these countries after the collapse of the USSR and communism and so on, these Eastern countries.
Hmm.
Has it changed much over the years?
Oh yeah. Um, for instance, one, I went to Budapest after they were freed, I guess is what the
Yeah.
USSR would say. Um, Stayed in a 5-star hotel, and we were lucky if we had running water and electricity at the same time. And every time you went down on the streets, all you'd see is lines. I mean, just because there'd be all, like Red Cross, etc., would be there, and they'd have these big trucks they drove in every day. And it just got to be because they had nothing. If you saw a truck, you'd start running towards it and get in line. You didn't care what it was, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And it was, and then fights would break out because they wouldn't have enough for everyone. And then, like, maybe someone's walking away with a bag of rice and someone just knock them over the head and take, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very hard. I was a volunteer there, and it was very, very hard to see this, desperation. One story that I'd like to tell, and I put it in the book. I was riding my bike, on a Friday afternoon to get some groceries at the nearest supermarket where my apartment was. And at that time, they still had the European hours. So they were going to close at 5 o'clock, and they weren't going to open until 7 or 8 on Monday morning. So you had to make sure you got there to get your weekend supplies. So I was on my way, and I was parking my bike, and this woman, refugee woman, runs up, and she has 2 small children with her, and she's carrying a baby. And she's speaking to me in a language I did not know. I do speak several languages, but I don't know Slavic languages. But I'm getting the gist of it, that she has nothing to eat, and neither do her children. And so I'm patting her on the shoulder. And right when I do that, a policeman that was guarding the door of the supermarket came up to me and like grabbed me really hard and told me in German that I was not to speak to them and I was not to help them, because if you help them, they'll stay.
Wow.
And I said to him in German, I'm an American. I am not Austrian. I am here on a work visa, and I can do whatever the hell I want to do. Well, he didn't like that. And so I just walked away from him, and I went in the store. And so I got everything I could think of that they need. I never had a baby, so I was trying to kind of figure that out.
Yeah.
And I had to figure it out in German, looking at labels and all. And so finally I got some stuff, the stuff I needed and the stuff that I got for the family. And I checked out, and I'm pushing the cart, towards them. And he runs up beside me and stops me. And he says, I am going to arrest you if you bring that. I told you not to help them. And I said, again, I don't think I'm breaking any laws. And he said, oh, yes, you are. And I said, well, I didn't read that in the papers. I didn't see it on TV where, anyone said that you cannot help a refugee. And so we're going back and forth. And so, I'm pretty stubborn person. So I just keep pushing it towards her. Well, she's kind of running down the park, and I'm like, wait, because she's getting scared of this guy, he has a gun, he has a, nightstick. Of course she's scared. And so, I was saying, no, it's okay, because I can't speak her language, right? And so I'm just trying to give her body language and tell her. Well, finally she does stop, and I give the one sack to the little boy and one sack to the little girl. They just run. And then, I'm talking to her and saying, it's okay. And he grabs me and he turns me around and he spits in my face. Well,
talk about breaking the law. But anyway, go ahead.
Welcome to Austria in the late 80s. You have to understand, their prime minister, Kurt Waldheim, won on the Nazi ticket at that very time. If you got on a bus and you saw these businessmen going to work, at least 50% of them were reading the Nazi paper. Okay, so we kind of know where his affiliations lie, this policeman. And, and I was very aware, of that party being very strong. And so you have to watch yourself when you're a foreigner. And I was a foreigner too, just like her. And so after wiping my face, I mean, I really, really wanted to give him a kick or something.
Yeah.
And I do know martial arts, but I was like, no, gotta stay cool. And I just told her to run. And she did, and caught up with the children and, kept running. So that was the first experience I had knowing how unwelcome these people were in Austria. Yeah.
That's
and
so sad.
I got involved. Yeah, I got involved because I was like, this is absolutely not right.
And so the book is in part to try to bring awareness to all that, I would think.
Absolutely. There are bits of it that are pretty darn graphic, but it's all true and it's all documented. Sometimes people about human trafficking, they think, oh, it's not in my backyard, I'm not going to think about that. Well, I live in a very small college town, about 17,000 people. And 2 months ago, on the front page of this small paper here in town, there were 7 men that were arrested for many counts of human trafficking of underage women and prostitution. So guess what, folks? It is in your backyard. If it's in this little town, it's probably in yours too. And we have to be aware before we can do anything. So we have to open our eyes. And I hope this book opens the eyes of the reader to say, oh my God, I knew things were bad, but I didn't realize that torture, this kind of thing went on. Well, yeah. It does. And the International Labor Union estimates that 21 million people are are victims of human trafficking right now as we speak throughout the world. That's a lot of people.
It is a lot of people.
So most likely, we've all seen some hint of that going on. It didn't register as it at the time. If you're just walked out of a restaurant and you're walking to your car that's parked on the street and you happen to go by an alley and there's restaurants on that row and all of a sudden you see people being kind of shoved out and put in a truck, that's probably human trafficking. And a lot of people don't pay attention, but like if they stop and think, that doesn't look right. And if those people look like they may be from another country, yeah. And all you have to do is call the authorities, And other ways that you can help are by, that you can get involved are, donate to all the different organizations that are fighting this.
Now, was the book self-published or do you have a publisher?
I self-published, but it's more of a hybrid publishing company. That's kind of a new thing that's going on. And so I cannot learn all those different facets of publishing a book.
Right.
It just wasn't in my, skill set. And it also wasn't even interesting to me. I don't want to learn how to do graphic illustration. And such, okay. So what I did is I hired a hybrid company that had all these different departments that dealt with this. And I had complete um, artistic control, and I was able to negotiate a great deal on my net profits.
Mm.
So I feel that after looking into the traditional publishing world and not being exactly pleased with it, to say the least, I think that was the right business choice for me to make. And I'm very happy I did it.
How do you market the book then?
Well, that was a tricky part.
Mm-hmm.
That publisher did have some marketing they started, but obviously, they agreed it wasn't enough. So at that point, I attended a virtual women's publishing seminar, and I really paid attention to all the companies that were presenting about marketing. And in that time, I felt one that I just was totally drawn to. And so I asked her if we could have a consultation, and we did. And the rest is history. I did hire her team and a publicist, Mickey, who you probably know.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's been going really great. That was the second smart thing I did, was to hire a publicity team.
Well, yeah, and marketing is a tricky thing. It's not the most complicated thing in the world, but you do have to learn it and you have to be disciplined. So good for you for finding someone to help, but you obviously recognize the need to market, which is extremely important. And
Yeah,
traditional
well,
publishers don't do nearly as much of it as they used to. Of course, there are probably a whole lot
right.
more authors than there used to be too, but still.
Hmm. Yeah, their marketing has changed completely. I remember I had a roommate that became a famous author, and just thinking about when he started, in the 80s, how the industry has completely changed.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's really tricky. The whole thing is very tricky. One thing that I also did is one of my graduate students needed a job. And so I've known her since eighth grade. I have been with this student a long time, and she's done very well. But she really is a whiz at the social media. And so she made all my accounts. I think I have 12 altogether. And every time I do something like what I'm doing tonight, as soon as it's released, she just puts it out there everywhere. And I have to thank her from the beginning that that's probably not my skill set.
Well, everyone has gifts, right? And the the people who I think are the most successful are the people who recognize that they have gifts. There are other people that have gifts that will augment or enhance what they do. And it's good that you find ways to collaborate. I think collaborating is such an important thing.
Oh,
And all
yes.
too many people don't. They think that they can just do it all. And some people
Oh.
can. I mean, I know that there are some people who can, but a lot of people don't and
Hmm.
can't.
Well, I've got other things I've got going, so maybe if I only had to do the book, um, everything to do with the book, that would be one thing. But I have other things I have to have in my life, and so I think
So,
that collaboration is also fun, and
mhm.
I'm very good at delegating. I have been very good at delegating for a long time. When I started my school, I also started a theater company. And if you know one thing, it's a three-ring circus to produce an opera or a musical.
Mhm.
And I've done a lot of them. And yeah, I would have not survived if I didn't learn how to delegate and trust people to do their own thing. And
So
I'll
what are
do
you doing
what my
today?
thing is.
What are you doing today besides writing?
Well, during COVID, everything got shut down in the
Mm-hmm.
arts, and I didn't have an income, and I had to do something. And believe it or not, one of my parents, of one of my students, um, is an attorney for the state of Wisconsin. And she was very worried. I mean, it looked like I might lose my house. I mean, I literally had no income. And so, I was a small business person. And so she offered me very graciously to come work in the Department of Workers' Compensation in the Legal Bureau at the state of Wisconsin. So I never have done anything like that in my life. I have never sat in a cubicle. I've never sat in front of a computer unless it was in a recording studio or something like that. So it was a crazy thing to have to do in my early 60s, but I'm a single woman and I had to do it. And I did, and it put me on solid ground. And that was one reason I could finish the book, because I didn't have to worry about a livelihood. And so I am continuing to do that. So as in the day, that is what I do. I'm a legal assistant.
Cool. And so when did Mission Thaw get published?
Mission Thaw, almost a year ago, in August of 2024, it launched. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was very scary for me, because my hybrid publisher is up in Canada, and they were telling me, well, we're going to get you some editorial reviews, and we're going to have you be interviewed. And, those very first things where my editor at the publisher had told me it was really a good book, and that was one of the cleanest books she ever had to edit. And so that kind of gave me some confidence. But you understand, look at my background. I didn't go to school to be a writer. I had never studied writing. I hadn't done any writing up until now. And so that was my first kind of sigh of relief when the editor at the publisher said it was really a good book. And then I started getting the editorial reviews, and they were all just stellar, and they continue to be. And I'm still a little shocked, because it takes time, I guess, for a person to switch gears and identify themselves as an author. But, after a year now, I'm feeling much more comfortable in my shoes about that. But at first it was trying, because I was scared and I was worried, what people were going to think about the book. Not the story so much as how it was crafted, but it ends up
ends up being part of the same thing. And the very fact that they love it, that means a lot.
Yeah. It does.
Is there more in the way of adventures from Caitlin coming up, or what's happening?
Yeah, this is hopefully a trilogy of Caitlin's most important standout missions. And so the second one is set in the early 90s during the Bosnian War. And this time she cannot use opera as a cover, because obviously in a war zone, there's no opera.
There's no opera.
And so she has to go undercover as either a UN volunteer or Red Cross. And this time her sidekick is not the Clive Matthews. He has actually started a special squad, combat squad, that's going in because, of course, none of us were really involved with that war, right? Mm-hmm. But that's what he's doing. And so, believe it or not, her sidekick, so to speak, is a priest that very early goes on and sees, this absolute ethnic cleansing going on, massacres. And he tries to get the Catholic Church to help. And they're like, no, we're not touching that. And so he goes AWOL, and had been friends in Vienna with the CIA during the first book. He goes to the CIA and says, this is what's going on. I saw it with my own eyes. I want to help. And so he becomes Caitlin's sidekick. which is a very interesting relationship. Caitlin, the opera singer, kind of modern girl, and then the kind of staunch priest. But
Yeah.
they find a way to work together, and they have to, because they have to save each other's lives a couple times. And this is my favorite book of the three. And so basically what happens, it's called Mission Impromptu, and I hope to have that finished at the end of this month. And the reason we call it impromptu is because her chief tells her to just get the information and get out. But her and the priest find out that there is a camp of orphaned boys that they are planning to come massacre. And so they basically go rogue and don't follow orders and go try to help the boys.
Mm.
Yeah. And then the third book, she has actually moved back to New York, and she's thinking, she does retire from the CIA, and it's the summer of 2001. And what happens in September of 2001? 9/11. And so they call her right back in. She literally had been retired for about 3 months.
Well, to my knowledge, I never met Caitlin, so I'm just saying.
Mm-hmm.
Having been in the World Trade Center on September 11th, but I don't think I met Caitlin. Anyway, go ahead.
No, she wasn't in the towers, but she was in New York. And so they called her back right away. And so the third one is going to be called Mission Homefront, because that's been her home for a very long time. She's been living in New York.
Are there plans for Caitlin beyond these 3 books?
I hope so. I think it would be fun for her to retire from the CIA and then move back to the Midwest, and it turned into a complete fiction. Of course, this is not true stuff, but like kind of a cozy mystery series,
right,
where things happen and people can't get anyone to really investigate it, so they come to Caitlin, and then maybe her ex-boss, the chief that's also retired, they kind of, gang up and become PI type,
Right.
I'm thinking that might be a fun thing to do.
Now, are mostly books 2 and 3 in the Mission series, are they also relatively nonfiction?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
Well, it's pretty fascinating to hear all of this and to see it, to hear about it from you, but to see it coming together, that is really pretty cool to see you experiencing. Has Mission Thaw been converted by any chance to audio? Is it available on Audible or anywhere?
It has not, but it is in my plans. There's a little bit of choice I have to make. Do I use my publisher and hire one of their readers, to do it? Someone, that's in equity, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or, my publicity or people are also saying, well, because you're an actor and all these accents, it might be nice for you to read your own book. Well, the problem is time, just the time to do it, because I'm so busy promoting the book right now and writing the second one that, I just don't know if I'm going to be able to pull that off. I have my own recording studio in my voice studio downstairs, but and I have all the equipment, I have engineers. It's just a matter of me being able to take the time to practice and to get that done. So it's probably going to be, I'll just use one of their people. But yes, it's coming. It's coming.
Well, it's tough. I know when we published last year, Live Like a Guide Dog, and the publisher, we did it through a traditional publisher. They worked with Dreamscape to create an audio version. And I actually auditioned remotely several authors and chose one. But it is hard to really find someone to read the book the way you want it read, because you know what it's like. And so there is merit to you taking the time to read it. But still, as you said, there are a lot of things going on.
Yeah, and I have read, you know, certain portions of the book because some podcasts that I've been on asked me to do that. And I practiced, and it went very well. And of course, when people hear that, they're like, "Oh, you're the one that has to do this. You know, Caitlin, you can speak her, her attitudes and all, and then you also know how to throw all those different accents out there because there's going to be like several. There's Dutch, there's German, there's Scottish, High British, and Austrian. I mean, all
Austrian,
those,
yeah.
yeah. Austrians speak different than Germans. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a challenge, but it's still something worth considering because you're going to bring a dimension to it that no one else really can because you wrote it and you really know what you want them to sound like.
Yeah.
But it's a process. I appreciate that. But you've got lots going on and you have to have an income. I know for me, we started Live Like a Guide Dog, my latest book, when the pandemic began, because I realized that although I had talked about getting out of the World Trade Center and doing so without exhibiting fear, didn't mean that it wasn't there, but I realized that I had learned to control fear because I learned a lot that I was able to put to use on the day of the emergency. And so the result of that was that, in fact, the mindset kicked in and I was able to function, but I never taught anyone how to do that. And so the intent of Live Like a Guide Dog was to be a way that people could learn how to control fear and not let fear overwhelm or, as I put it, blind them, but rather use fear as a very powerful tool to help you focus and do the things that you really need to do. But it's a choice. People have to learn that they can make that choice and that they can control it, which is kind of what really brought the book to mind. And the result was that we then did it. And so it came out last August as well.
Oh, well, if you read my book, you'll see Caitlin developing the same skills you were just talking about. She has to overcome fear all the time because she's never been in these situations before. And yet she has to survive,
Yeah. Well, and the reality is that most of us take too many things for granted and don't really learn. But if you learn, for example, if there's an emergency, do you know where to go in the case of an emergency? Do you know how to evacuate? Not by reading the signs, do you know? And that's the difference. The people who know have a mindset that will help them be a lot more likely to be able to survive because they know what all the options are. And if there's a way to get out, they know what they are rather than relying on signs, which may or may not even be available to you if you're in a smoke-filled environment, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, you should know ahead of time.
Yeah.
I know the state where I work, I mostly work at home. I'm able to do that, but we do have to go in once a week. And we just changed floors. They've been doing a lot of remodeling. And that was the first thing, the supervisor wanted us to do was walk through all the way for a tornado, fire, etc. And so we did that, and that's smart because then you're, like you say, you're not trying to look at a chart as you're running or whatever.
And you may need to do it more than once to make sure you really know it. I know for me, I spent a lot of time walking around the World Trade Center. In fact, I didn't even use my guide dog. I used a cane because with a cane, I'll find things that the dog would just automatically go around or ignore, like kiosks and other things. But I want to know where all that stuff is because I want to know what all the shops are down on the first floor. Well, now that isn't the case anymore, but it was at the time. There was a shopping mall and knowing where everything was, but also knowing where different offices were, knowing who was in which offices. And then knowing the really important things that most people don't know about, like where the Estee Lauder second store was on the 46th floor of Tower 2. You got to have the important things for wives. And so I learned with that. Well, it was, those are important things. But you'll learn a lot, and it's real knowledge. Someone on a recent podcast episode that they were on said something very interesting, and that is that we're always getting information, but information isn't knowing it. Knowledge is really internalizing the information and making it part of our psyche and really getting us to the point where we truly know it and can put it to use. And that is so true. It isn't just getting information. Well, that's great. I know that now. Well, no, you don't necessarily know it now until you internalize it, until you truly make it part of your knowledge. And I think that's something that a lot of people miss.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. If people want to reach out to you, is there a way they can do that?
Yeah, the best thing is my book website, kaysparlingbooks.com.
Spell that,
And
if you would.
KAYSP is in Paul, ARLINGBOOKS.com.
.com. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And you can email me through there. And all the media that I've been on is in the media section. The editorial reviews are there. There's another thing my student keeps up for me is the website. It's really developed. And so lots of information about the book and about me on there. And one thing I want to mention is just because of my background and all the people that, I know, a friend of mine is a composer, and he wrote a theme song, because we do hope that someday we can sell this, to for movie or Netflix or something like that. And so he wrote a theme song and theme music, and I just think that's fun. And then one of my students sang it, and then it's with a rock band, but it's very James Bondy kind of, with a little opera involved too. But not a lot of authors can say that on their website they have a theme song for their book. So
and where is it on the site?
It would be under. It's going to be about the author,
okay.
And there's a nice one of my other students is a graphic artist. She did a graphic. A scene of Caitlin with her ball gown, and she's got her foot up on a stool, and she's putting her pistol in her thigh holster. And I think it's kind of like a cartoon, and it quotes Caitlin saying, "I bet you I'm going to be the only belle at the ball with this accessory," meaning her pistol.
Her pistol, yeah.
And then right underneath that, the song. You can click it and hear it. We also are on YouTube. Mission Thaw does have its own YouTube channel, so you can find it there as well. So,
well, I want to thank you for being here and for telling us all the stories, and especially about Mission Thaw. I hope people will get it and read it, and I look forward to it coming out in audio at some point.
Yes,
I'll be lazy and wait for that.
okay.
I like to get books with human readers. I can get the print book and I can play it with a synthetic voice, but I really prefer human voices, and I know a lot of people who do. AI has not progressed to the point where it really can pull that off well.
No, it cannot. Yeah, I totally agree with you there.
So, well, thank you for being here, and I want to thank all of you for listening and watching us today. This has been fun. And as some of you know, if you listen to many of these podcasts, we have a rule on the podcast: you can't come on unless you're going to have fun. So we did have fun. Did you have fun? Yeah, see, there you go. I was going to ask if you had fun. Of course.
Yes.
So thank you all for listening. Love to hear from you. Love to hear what your thoughts are about today's episode. Feel free to email me at michaelhi@accessibe.com. That's michaelhi @accessibe.com. Also, please give us a 5-star rating. We appreciate it. Kale appreciate it. And when this goes up, when you hear it, we really value those ratings and reviews very highly. If you know anyone else who ought to be a guest, and Kay, you as well, love to hear from you. Please introduce us. Kay, you'll have to introduce us to Caitlin. But seriously, we always are looking for more guests. So if anyone knows of anyone who ought to come on and tell a story, we'd love to hear from you. But again, Kay, I want to thank you one last time. This has been great, and we really appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you for having me.